On April 28, 2000, a 24-year-old named Yuri Lipsky was standing in front of a cafe in Dahab, Egypt, overlooking the Red Sea. He had traveled all the way to the Sinai Peninsula from Moscow in order to film himself swimming through the Arch, but now it was looking like that probably wasn't going to happen. The Arch is an 85-foot-long underwater tunnel that connects a massive sinkhole right on Dahab's shoreline called the Blue Hole to the Red Sea. To get to the Arch, you need to enter the Blue Hole directly and descend straight down 181 feet, where you'll reach the top of the tunnel on the northeast side. But there's a catch. If on your descent you happen to miss the ceiling of this arch, which apparently it's pretty easy to do, you run the risk of going too deep. Now, going too deep does not mean you're going to miss the tunnel altogether. The arch actually starts at 181 feet, but then goes all the way down to 393 feet. So it's a huge, huge opening. The risk of going too deep has to do with how your body responds to the type of gas you're breathing. For those who are unfamiliar with diving, generally speaking, you have two types of dives. There's recreational diving, where you breathe the same air that you breathe on the surface. They literally jam air directly into scuba bottles. You breathe that and you go down to 130 feet. That's the recommended bottom depth that you would go down breathing regular air. And then there is technical diving, where you breathe a special mixture of gases. Typically, it's going to be a mixture of helium, nitrogen, and oxygen that allow you to go below 130 feet. This type of diving is exponentially more dangerous and requires all sorts of additional training. Because the minimum depth you would need to go to in order to access the arch is 181 feet, that puts you well in the technical diving range, which means you should be diving mixed gas and have special training and equipment. But year after year, people try to dive down to the arch and go through it on regular air. And year after year, people die doing it. When your body absorbs too much nitrogen, you can get something called nitrogen narcosis, which is a lot like being drunk. And in extreme cases, divers who get this have been known to remove their mouthpiece and inhale water, believing they are actually on the surface. Below 130 feet, your body absorbs nitrogen much faster, and regular air is a whopping 78% nitrogen. So the risk of getting nitrogen narcosis is exponentially higher if you're breathing regular air below 130 feet. Also, oxygen can become toxic the deeper you go in the water column. It can lead to blackouts and convulsions that if you don't have someone there to literally physically move you up in the water column, you won't recover from it and you'll die. Regular air contains 21% oxygen, which is a lot of oxygen. So if you're diving regular air below 130 feet, you are at an increased risk of developing O2 toxicity. Now, to be clear, it is possible on regular air to dive down to 181 feet and make it through the arch and come out the other side and be just fine. But you're realistically at 181 feet pushing the absolute boundary of what you can get away with on regular air. Below 200 feet, you're probably dead. So if you're attempting to swim through the arch on regular air, you need to be paying very close attention to your depth as you descend so that you don't miss the arch and accidentally drift down below 181 feet to the very deadly 200 feet and beyond. So earlier in the day, Yuri had gone down to the edge of the Blue Hole and he had found one of the diving instructors that taught inside the Blue Hole. His name was Tarek Omar, and he asked him if he'd be willing to take him down to the arch to help him film himself going through the arch. And Tarek said, yes, but I need to train you for 2 weeks before you're going to be considered qualified to do that. And you need a special setup with a special gas mixture to do this dive. And Yuri was like, well, I'm leaving in 2 days to head back to Moscow, so I need to do this dive now. Is there any way you can do it today or tomorrow even? And Tarek was like, no, that's not how this works. And Tarek understood this more than anybody else, because in addition to teaching diving at the Blue Hole, Tarek's job was to dive down to the bottom and retrieve the dead bodies of inexperienced or overconfident divers that attempted the archway and didn't make it. Although there is not an official body count of how many people have perished inside of the Blue Hole, locals believe it's as high as 200 people just in the last decade. After Tarek was unwilling to take him without properly training him and outfitting him with the right equipment, Yuri thanked him and went on to a couple different other diving instructors with the same request. Will you take me in the next couple of days? And they all said, no, we need to train you and you need special equipment. And so finally, after no one was willing to do this, Yuri just left. Later that day, owners of cafes that overlooked the blue hole remember seeing a young man who was by himself walk to the edge of the blue hole. He puts on all of his scuba gear, he puts on a helmet and then straps a big camera to the top and ratchets it down. And then after he's got all his stuff on, he jumps into the blue hole and he disappears. That man was Yuri. A few days later, Yuri's family back home in Moscow did not see him get off the flight he was supposed to be on, and they reported him missing. Tarek Omar was contacted to go down into the blue hole and see if Yuri was down there. Tarek hopped in the blue hole, he went to the bottom, and sure enough, lying face down at the bottom was Yuri. When they brought Yuri to the surface, they realized his camera had been running the whole time, and he had actually filmed his final moments. Yuri's final video exists online so you can watch it for yourself, but here is a description of what happens. After situating his camera on his head just the way he wanted it, he hit record, and then he jumped into the water. It was determined later on that Yuri was breathing regular air out of his tanks. The camera submerges under the water, and then Yuri begins to sink very quickly into the blue hole. But his breathing seems normal, and he's not thrashing around, so it seems like it's a controlled descent. But at some point, you hear Yuri trying to activate his buoyancy compensator. Basically, it's this life jacket, to describe it simply, that sits on your gear that you have a demand valve where you can inflate and deflate the air into it to neutralize your buoyancy. Or, in an emergency situation, you can fully inflate it and stop yourself from sinking. In fact, you'll rise to the surface. But he's trying to activate his buoyancy compensator to slow down his descent, and the air is escaping his compensator. There's a leak, and he can't slow down his descent. Now, Yuri was wearing a weight belt, which is very common in diving. In fact, I don't really know of all that many dives that you wouldn't use a weight belt. And any diver knows that there is a quick release function on your weight belt. Specifically, if you're in an uncontrolled descent or if you're in an emergency situation and need to get to the surface, you can jettison your weight belt and go to the surface. But Yuri was panicking and he was fixated on his buoyancy compensator that he was desperately trying to activate, and it was failing. And so he's not going for his weight belt. And then he rockets past the entrance to the arch. So he goes below 181 feet, he goes below 200 feet, and he goes all the way to the bottom where he hits the bottom at 392 feet. And then he begins to slide because the bottom of the blue hole was actually at an angle, and that archway went all the way to the bottom of the hole. And if you slipped out of the blue hole, it was a sheer drop off for thousands of feet. And you see on camera, Yuri rolls over and he's desperately clawing into the mud to stop himself from sliding out of the blue hole to definite death. And he's trying to get himself to stop, and finally he anchors himself in the dirt. And it's calm for a second, and he's kind of looking around. It's very clear he's confused, and then it goes still. And it's believed at this point he either removed his mouthpiece because of nitrogen narcosis, he pulled it out and inhaled water, or he was dealing with O2 toxicity and he blacked out and the mouthpiece came out. But either way, he drowned. Our next story is called Drown or Glory. There is a remote cliff face in northern England that rarely gets tourists. If you were standing in front of it, you would see this little stream that went into a break in the limestone. It's this little tiny hole, and that stream is called the Mossdale Beck. If you crouched down and walked through that hole, you would be entering the Mossdale Caverns, which since 1967 have been permanently sealed off to cavers. Once inside the Mossdale Caverns entranceway, you could look down and see that little stream, the Mossdale Beck, would be going between your legs, and then right in front of you, it would split in two distinct directions down respective tunnels. To the right, the water flows down 7 miles of accessible passageway. However, most of it is incredibly tight and it's prone to flooding. As a result, fewer people have seen the far reaches of the right side of Mossdale Cavern than have stepped on the moon. To the left, the water goes through these impenetrable rocks that no one has gotten past. In fact, no one knows what's beyond these rocks. However, scientists have determined the water that goes left at the entranceway will re-emerge 18 days later, 5 miles away, 900 feet lower, in a pool called the Black Keld. The massive tunnel system that we know exists but has yet to be explored that connects the entranceway to Black Keld is referred to as the missing link. You would think cavers from all over the world would be clamoring to get inside that accessible side, the right side of Mossdale Caverns, and try to find a secret access point back to the missing link, to be the first person to discover that, to stake your claim and say, that was me. But in fact, since the Mostel Caverns was discovered in 1941 until 1967, almost no one went in Mostel Caverns. Endless, tight, water-filled crawls with names like Drown or Glory made Mostel Caverns feel like too big of a risk to be worth it. But in 1967, 10 extremely fit, extremely experienced cavers said, you know what? We are going in Mostel Cavern and we are going to find that entrance to the missing link. So on June 24th, 1967, these 10 cavers entered Mostel Caverns. They went right into the accessible 7 miles of passageway and they began their descent. And it wasn't that long until 2 of the 10 cavers, the 2 least experienced of the group, said, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. Got a bad feeling about this, but we don't know the way out. And so they needed chaperones to leave. And so 2 other cavers from the group had to go with them. So 4 cavers, they leave Mostel Caverns. The other 6 are going to continue on. So when the 4 got back to the surface, it was about 5 p.m. They had been in the cavern for several hours at this point. And when they went in, initially, the weather was great. It was beautiful. It was clear. Now they're coming out again, and it had started to rain. Not significantly, it was more like a drizzle, but they were a little bit concerned because they knew the other 6 were planning to be in the cavern until after midnight. So they were just hopeful that the rain did not get any worse. But just a couple of hours later, the skies opened up and it rained like it hadn't rained in years. Just torrential downpour, and the 4 were really concerned about the other 6. So they went back to the entrance hoping that maybe, the other 6 would have heard the rain, although it's very unlikely considering how deep they were going to be. But they were hoping that maybe they'd be coming out again and they would see them and get them back to safety. But when they arrived there, not only were the 6 not out of the cave, but the actual entrance to the cave was completely submerged in water. Earlier that day, when the 4 cavers turned around and left, the other 6 cavers, they continued on, and they had made it about 2 miles deep into these caves. They had passed the fabled Drown or Glory swim, they had survived the knee wrecker passage, and they had bit their tongue as they squeezed through the famously painful Umaguli tunnel. Now located hours away from the only way out. So they are way into this cave. They were nearing the end of this distant section of the cave that they believed on the other end, they would find this hidden entrance into the missing link. All they had to do was pass through the Far Marathon section, which is a 900-foot tunnel that is only 10 inches high, 2 feet wide, and you have to wriggle through on your stomach with your face pressed against a stream that runs through it. And it takes a very long time to get through it. It's incredibly claustrophobia inducing. It's considered one of the most stressful things you can do in caving. But considering how experienced these cavers were and the fact that they had come down there specifically to get to this far point in the cave, you gotta figure that their spirits were high. They were probably joking with each other as they're doing this awful thing. And then they made it about 3/4 of the way through this tunnel when someone must have noticed the distant rumbling sound and said, "Hey, what is that?" And as they sat there listening, trying to discern what the sound was, it must have dawned on them that their worst nightmare was about to come true. That was the sound of surging water. This tunnel is about to flood. They began crawling faster and faster down the marathon tunnel. Not only was it very difficult to move quickly inside of this very tight tunnel, but they also knew there was nowhere to go. They're 2 miles underground. They must have felt like the world of sunshine and fresh air was suddenly an eternity away. The oldest of the group was 26, the rest of them were all in their teens. United now by fear, the water came rushing in as they're all pinned inside of the Far Marathon tunnel, and their face is already up against the river, and now this river is surging with water. And so they're all desperately trying to crawl through this flooding tunnel, and the leader of the group, the guy literally in the front, John Ogden, who was 26, he managed to get all the way through the Far Marathon tunnel to the space where they anticipated finding that secret entrance into the missing link. That wasn't there, but he found above him there was a small fissure in the rocks. There was an air pocket, and he managed to get his head up into the space right as the water in the Far Marathon cave completely submerged. So any of the cavers in there, they drowned inside of the Far Marathon. The bubble that he was in was a little bit bigger, and so some of the cavers managed to get in there, and they tried to clamber into this air pocket as well, but ultimately there was only enough room for one person, and John was the only one up there. And so as the water levels filled the room he was in up to his neck, everyone below John drowned. Now, we don't know if John literally kept other people from getting into this air pocket with him. All we know is it could only hold one person, and ultimately John was the one who was left inside of this crevice. But this air pocket was really just delaying the inevitable because there wasn't very much air inside of it, and John's 2 miles below the surface. There is no way anyone is going to get to him in time. And so he ended up dying a couple days later, and when they found him, he was still in the air pocket trying to get one last breath. What I've not covered in this story that I would encourage you all to check out is there was this incredible effort to try to save these cavers before anyone knew they were deceased. There was this hope that maybe they found an air pocket and they were still alive. And so they basically created this artificial dam that was very precarious. The water could at any moment spill over, and it provided just enough drainage inside of this cavern for some of the best cavers in the world to go into the cavern to look for them. And so they went into this cavern knowing at any minute that makeshift dam on the surface could break and they will 100% drown in here. No one's coming to get them. They had to crawl through the Far Marathon Tunnel all the way down at the bottom to get to the lost cavers. And ultimately, when they discovered they were all deceased, it would have been impossible to remove their bodies. And so the decision was made to leave the 6 cavers where they died and seal off the cave permanently. So in 1967, they sealed it off, and they now treat Mossdale Caverns like a gravesite, and no one goes in it. The next and final story of today's episode is called 10 Years Later. For any diver who can stomach the risks, Bushman's Hole is a world-class diving spot. It's located on a privately owned game farm in South Africa. In the middle of the farm's 11,000 acres sits this massive crater in the ground that from rim to rim is hundreds of feet wide. If you hike down the crater to the middle, there's this little tiny basin of water that almost looks like an oversized puddle. This is the entrance to Bushman's Hole. Once you step into this little puddle and push your way through the very claustrophobia-inducing entrance, you open up into the biggest freshwater cave in the world that goes down to nearly 900 feet. For the people that have been in there, they say it's unbelievable and it's like spacewalking. For young South African Dion Dreyer, the pull to go to Bushman and explore it was irresistible. Dion had always been a bit of an adrenaline junkie. By the time he was 17, he was racing cars and building motorcycles, and by the time he was 20, he had picked up a new activity, cave diving. Dion had logged about 200 dives before he was invited by a diving group to go to Bushman's Hole and explore it on Christmas break 1994. They were planning a descent to 492 feet, so about the halfway point of the cave, and they needed one more diver, and so Dion was thrilled to go. The dive was going great, but on the way up, as they were making their ascent, the diver ahead of Dion looked back at him, and Dion seemed fine. He gave the hand signal that everything was going great. He had his flashlight out, and then about 30 feet higher in the water, that same diver turned around to check on Dion, and Dion wasn't there anymore. And in fact, this guy saw his flashlight that was still attached to him, basically wavering as it sunk farther and farther down Bushman's Hole. This diver immediately stops the group above him, and he turns around and starts swimming as fast as he can down to try to get to Dion. But Dion was sinking so quickly that this diver realized that it's a suicide mission if I try to go down there. I will either pass out or run out of air. And so deeply saddened, this group of divers had to turn around and leave Dion at the bottom of Bushman's Hole. Although the other divers didn't know for sure, they told Dion's parents that most likely he had suffered from a deep water blackout and then had drowned. When authorities were notified about what happened to Dion, they sent a robot down to the bottom of Bushman's Hole to just locate his body before they sent a person down there. But they never could find his body, they could only ever find his helmet. Dion's parents are devastated. They're never going to see their son again. And since they don't have a body to bury, they decide to go down to Bushman's Hole and put a plaque up next to the entrance to commemorate their son. 10 years later, Dave Shaw, who was a 50-year-old extremely audacious cave diver, was passing the 800-foot mark inside of Bushman's Hole, becoming the 3rd person ever to reach this depth. Shaw touched down on the sloping bottom of the cave. He detached from the cave reel, took out his flashlight, and began swimming around the bottom. As he was scanning around, he looked about 50 feet to his left, and he saw something he immediately recognized. It was a human body. They were on their back with their arms stretched out towards the surface, and when Shaw went over to them, he immediately recognized that this is Dion Dreyer. Ever since Dion died inside of Bushman and had never been recovered, any diver that went in there was keeping their eye out in case they saw him. Shaw examines Dion to see if he's going to be able to be pulled to the surface, if he's solid enough to be pulled to the surface, and he can tell that his hands have skeletonized as well as his skull, although his mask is still placed directly on his skull. But his wetsuit and his tanks had kind of kept the rest of his body pretty tight, which gave him some mass, which meant he'd be able to move him. But as soon as Shaw tried to move him, he couldn't get him to budge because his tanks were caught on something. And so Shaw stayed there for a minute trying to get him free, but he couldn't do it. And that's when Shaw started to think, okay, this is getting irresponsible. I'm going to die down here too if I don't start making my ascent soon. So he ended up tying a line to Dion's body so he could be located again. And then Shaw began the very slow ascent back to the surface. On the way back up, Shaw felt an extreme sense of connection with Dion. He really felt bad for this kid, and all he wanted to do was get him back on land to give back to his family, to give them some closure. And so when he got on the surface, he immediately contacted authorities and said, I'm going to go back down and I'm going to get him. And Shaw also called Dion's parents and told them, I am going to retrieve your son. And his parents were apparently overjoyed. They couldn't believe they were going to get to see their son again. After lots and lots of planning, Shaw's recovery of Dion was scheduled for January 8th, 2005. The dive was going to take 12 hours, and it wasn't just going to be Dave doing the retrieval. It was going to be like a relay race. Dave would be the first one down, and a couple minutes after he entered the water, another diver would go in who would stop about 100 feet above Dave, and then a third diver would go in and stop 100 feet above the second diver, and so on and so forth. Dave would put the body bag over Dion and then carry his body up to the first guy, who would turn around, bring the body up to the next guy, and the next guy to the next guy until Dion was out of the water. At 6:13 in the morning, Shaw entered the water with a camera on his helmet to film the operation. Shortly after he submerged, Dion's parents walked down to the edge of the water to watch. They showed up intentionally late so as not to put added pressure on Shaw. Shaw dropped very quickly to the bottom of Bushman's Hole. He actually arrived about a minute and a half faster than he expected to. As soon as he got down, he shined his light and he found Dion's body. He went over to him, he got the body bag out, and he got to work. 13 minutes after Shaw had submerged, the diver who was slotted above him, that would be the first to receive Dion's body, began looking for signs that Shaw was done and was moving up towards him. But when he looked down, he saw Shaw's flashlight wasn't moving. This diver continued to watch the flashlight very intently to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. And after a couple of minutes and still no movement, this diver begins going deeper and deeper to try to get a better look at Shaw to see what's going on. And when he got a little bit closer, it became very clear that Shaw was not moving. This diver immediately goes into rescue mode and starts going straight down to get to Shaw to try to help him if he still can. And as he's moving down, he hears this fizzling sound and he looks at his wrist and he can tell that one of his gauges has broken. And this gauge was vital to the dive and it meant he would not be able to get down there. And so with a heavy heart, he had to turn around and go back up. And because of the depth at which they were diving, he could not just go right to the surface and tell everybody what had happened. He needed to stop at various decompression stops along the way. But he had a slate, and on it he wrote in his grease pen, "Dave's not coming back." And he swam the slate up to the next diver who would have received Dion's body, but instead receives this slate. He takes the slate up to the next diver, to the next diver, to the next diver, all the way up to the surface. As soon as this message was read out loud to the group standing around Bushman's Hole, which included Dion's parents, there was 30 seconds of stunned silence. No one could believe this was happening. And then after the silence, Dion's parents are beside themselves. Not only are they not going to see their son probably ever again, but they feel like they are somehow responsible for Shaw's death. Eventually, by the end of the night, all of the other divers that were in the water that day successfully exited the cave and were just fine. As for Shaw, much like Dion, there really wasn't a good way to get him out, and so everyone came to terms with the reality that he was going to be down there with Dion probably forever. The news was so devastating that the team decided to leave all their equipment in place. Eventually, they did need to go down and collect their gear, so everybody goes down to the edge of Bushman's Hole, and before they begin retrieving all of the lines, they sang Amazing Grace in memoriam for the lost diver. Afterwards, they started pulling up the lines, and as they're doing that, they notice all these bubbles coming up from the bottom of the cave. And they looked a little bit closer, and it was Shaw's body and Dion's body. Basically, Shaw had been attached to this line, and he had managed to free Dion before he had passed. And so when they pulled the line, both of them were freed and they floated to the surface. And so even though Shaw would die doing it, he was able to get Dion out of Bushman's Cave for his family. After the two bodies were taken out, they noticed that the camera on Dave's head was still intact, and it had filmed everything all the way through his final moments. And so they took the tape out and they watched it forward and backwards, slow-mo, frame by frame, and they analyzed it to the point where they understood what happened. When Shaw gets down to Dion, Dion's body that had previously been stuck, and that was the reason Shaw had not been able to free him the first time, somehow he's become unfree and he's now free-floating. And Shaw is having a really hard time trying to control this free-floating body, and his body is literally breaking apart in front of him. As Shaw is trying to wrangle his body, you can hear him start grunting, his breathing is getting elevated, and he's totally losing control of the situation, and the bottom of this cave is slanted, and it's all silty and muddy, and so in the camera you see all this mud and silt getting kicked around, and the visibility is very poor, and after it clears, you see Shaw has gotten completely tangled in some line that's also tangled on Dion. So basically, Dion has become his anchor. At this point, Shaw shifts his focus to try to get the lines off of himself, and you can hear his breathing now is becoming much more desperate. It almost sounds like he's gulping for air, and probably at this point, although we don't know for sure, he's suffering from narcosis, which is a condition that divers will run into, where it's like you've drank a whole bunch of alcohol on an empty stomach. It's like you're totally drunk and you're confused, and it's clear that he's becoming a little bit disoriented. And instead of going away from Dion's body to try to go back up and save yourself, instead, he turns and starts fumbling with Dion's midsection, and then he gets out a pair of scissors, but he doesn't use them, he just holds them. Finally, he turns away from Dion because it's clear you're not going to be able to get him out at this point, and with the scissors in hand that he never used, because again, he's probably suffering from narcosis and he's confused, he starts beginning to make his way over to the area where you can go back up. But he starts slowing down, his breathing becomes tragically desperate, and then it becomes silent, and then there's no more movement, and Dave Shaw is dead. 10 days after the bodies were recovered from Bushman's Hole, Dion's parents, although they are absolutely devastated about what happened to Shaw, and they feel very guilty, but at the same time, they're so excited because they get to go to the morgue and see their son again for the first time in 10 years. They don't care what state his body's in. Just the fact that he's actually here, that their actual son is going to be in front of them, was just overwhelming for them. And when they went in, they were really fixated on the fact that he had underwear on that they both recognized. Apparently they had bought him a set of jockey underwear and he was wearing jockey underwear. As strange as it was like they got to bond with their child one more time. When classes began at Drexel University in Philadelphia on the morning of November 30th, 1984, students walking into Randall Hall made a gruesome discovery. Crumpled at the bottom of an outdoor stairwell underneath a gray jacket was the body of a young woman. She had cuts and bruising all over her face, and she had a deep purple line that went all around her neck from where she had been strangled to death. She had no purse, no backpack, nothing to identify her. There was no evidence of sexual assault because she was fully clothed, although she was missing her shoes and socks. Police immediately cordoned off the area. Their first suspicion was this was a robbery that turned deadly. But right away, the police knew they were in for a very difficult investigation because, one, there were no cameras inside or outside of Randall Hall, so they couldn't just review the footage to see what happened to Debbie. And two, there was a virtually unlimited number of suspects because Drexel University was not an isolated campus. Its buildings were integrated into West Philadelphia, and Randall Hall itself was located right along a known cut-through that residents that lived in and around Drexler would use almost every single day. And it was clear this young woman had not been killed in this stairwell. She had been killed elsewhere and then dragged a great distance, losing her shoes in the process before being dumped at this spot. But just a couple of hours after the body was discovered, the police received a lucky break when a young man who was combative and frantic rushed the closed-off crime scene and demanded he be let through because he said he knew the identity of the dead girl. The police were immediately suspicious because they didn't even know who this dead girl was. So they pull the young man aside and they interview him, and he tells police his name is Kurt Rayner, he's a student at Drexel University, and he believes the girl they had found, the dead girl, was his girlfriend, 20-year-old Debbie Wilson, who was also a student. And then he proceeded to give police a very long and complicated explanation of how he figured out the girl inside was his girlfriend. He said the night before he was with Debbie in Randall Hall in the computer lab in the basement. He said Debbie Debbie had a big project that was due the next day and that he had offered to just keep her company while she worked. But by about 1:30 in the morning, Debbie still had a lot of work to do, and Kurt said he was just really tired and didn't know if he could stay awake any longer, and so he asked Debbie if it would be okay if he took off early. Debbie said it was totally fine. She was used to working late at this computer lab, and Kurt, even though he wanted to stick around and walk her safely to her car when she was done, he felt like she was okay, and so he took off on his own. On his walk back to the dorm, Kurt said he passed by a campus security guard, and he actually asked him if he wouldn't mind checking on his girlfriend in the computer lab because she was all alone and it was late, and the security guard said, "No problem, I'll make sure she's okay." The next morning when Kurt woke up, he heard rumors from other students on campus about a woman's body being found just outside of Randall Hall, and that apparently it looked like murder. Kurt said he didn't think much of it at first, but that day when he went into campus to meet up with Debbie, he saw her car still parked in the computer lab parking lot, looking like it had never left. And then when he got to the meeting site, Debbie never showed. And he said it was at that point that he realized the dead woman in Randall Hall must be Debbie. And he wasn't wrong, it was Debbie, but the police were not buying his story. He was the last person to see Debbie alive, and by his own admonition, he had heard that morning about a dead woman being found at Randall Hall, the very place he had left his girlfriend the night before all alone. But it took him hours to bring this up to anyone. The police also noticed he had bruises on his knuckles and a deep cut between his fingers. Suddenly, Kurt seemed like the killer, and this crime that initially looked like a robbery gone wrong now looked like something much more personal. Strangulation is intimate. The killer almost always is face to face with their victim, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of rage. And afterwards, the killer had covered Debbie's body with her jacket, an act that indicated remorse or even respect. And investigators know that generally when a woman is murdered, her romantic partner is the culprit. Instead of tipping off Kurt that they were looking at him as the primary suspect, they told him to go back to his dorm room and they would be in touch with him as the investigation developed. In the meantime, investigators turned their attention to the computer lab in Randall Hall, where Kurt said Debbie had been last. Debbie had logged into a computer at the front of the lab, but had not logged out. Her computer cursor was left blinking mid-sentence at 1:38 a.m., leading investigators to believe she was interrupted by her attacker inside of the lab. Investigators found 2 extension cords on the ground near this computer that matched the ligature marks on Debbie's neck. They also found a small spot of blood on the back of Debbie's chair that they sent off for testing. As police swept the computer lab, they began commenting on how neat everything looked, considering that there must have been some sort of death struggle that took place in there. And that's when they realized there had been a huge setback in this case. The janitor that morning had cleaned the computer lab and the hall right outside, likely destroying critical physical evidence. They interviewed the janitor, who had a rock-solid alibi and was incredibly remorseful at unintentionally destroying the crime scene. And so they asked the janitor, before you cleaned it up, was there anything strange about the computer lab or the hallway right outside of the computer lab? And the janitor said no, it was all normal, but she did say it looked like the tables and chairs had been moved around inside of the computer lab, but it didn't stand out to her because it always looked that way when she went in to clean it up. Because the police lacked physical evidence, they couldn't just go arrest Kurt, even though they wanted to. And so instead, they asked him if he'd be willing to come down to the station for a formal interview, and he said he would. During the interview, Kurt insisted he had nothing to do with Debbie's death. As for the bruises and cut on his hand, he said he had punched a wall after finding out what had happened to Debbie, and the cut in the middle of his fingers was from working on his car, but neither of those things could be proven. After this interview yielded no new results, and they still had no evidence on Kurt, they told him he could go, and in the interim, they began digging into his alibi. Kurt had previously told police that after leaving Debbie in the computer lab, on his walk back to his dorm, he had passed a security guard and asked that security guard to check on Debbie. And so the police were able to track down that security guard who confirmed Kurt's alibi. The security guard's name was Bryce Clapman, who was a longtime employee of Drexel University with a stellar work record and no criminal history. Clapman said he spoke with Kurt around 1:30 in the morning as Kurt was walking back towards the dorms. After speaking with Kurt, Clapman radioed Bronson Ziegler, who was one of the 2 security guards that were working in Randall Hall that night, and he told him that he or the other guy, David Dixon, would need to go down into the basement and check on this girl. Shortly after radioing Ziegler, Clapman would say he saw a person, presumably a student, come out of Randall Hall. He said he was just too far away and it was too dark that he couldn't make out any features, but he definitely saw someone walking around the premise around 1:30 in the morning. Clapman told police he never stepped foot inside of Randall Hall that night and that he was willing to take a lie detector test. Police ran the backgrounds of Bronson Ziegler and David Dixon. Dixon was a military veteran with a pristine record who was still in the Army Reserves. As for Ziegler, he had spent time in jail for burglary and had actually lied about it to get his job as a security guard. When police interviewed Ziegler, he was evasive and frustrated, and he said that he did receive the message from Clapman to go check on the girl, but he didn't feel like doing it himself, so he radioed Dixon and said he should go do it. Ziegler insisted he had done his rounds properly and he had never stepped foot inside of the computer lab. He told detectives they could check his security guard clock that he carried with him every time he did rounds, which was basically like a punch card where there was designated stations along his security rounds where he would punch this card that stamped a time that he had arrived at that station. And so over the course of the night, he would punch his card at each of these stations, and there was a record of what time he arrived and what time he left. And so when they checked this record, it showed that Ziegler had hit all the stations at the correct time. But that didn't mean he didn't kill her, because there was lots of time in between rounds that he could have attacked her. Towards the end of the interview, Ziegler accused detectives of messing with him, and then he sarcastically said he had killed Debbie, and then he refused to take a lie detector test. When the police interviewed Dixon, he said that Ziegler had never radioed him asking him to check on the girl in the computer lab. However, he did say he was aware of someone working late in the computer lab because around 2:15 in the morning he had walked past and the lights were on and he heard the sound of printers working inside. And so not wanting to disturb whoever was in there, he didn't even poke his head in. He just figured he would come back in a couple hours and make sure they were gone. And so over the next couple of hours, he chatted on the phone with his girlfriend, and then around 4 in the morning, he went back down to the computer lab and the lights were off and the door was locked. And so he figured whoever had been in there had finished up and left, and Ziegler had locked up after them. When asked why he or Ziegler had not discovered Debbie's body, he said their security rounds did not leave the building, and so that stairwell was considered outside of the building, and so they never would have seen her. At this point, Clapman and Dixon were ruled out as suspects, but Ziegler became a primary suspect. But just as with the boyfriend, Kurt Rayner, there was no physical evidence tying Ziegler to the crime, and so they couldn't arrest him. Investigators decided instead to try to track down that person Clapman had seen walking around Randall Hall around 1:30 in the morning after speaking with Kurt and after radioing Ziegler. It would turn out to be 28-year-old PhD student Ashlyn Berhard, who was known for keeping long hours and was also known for sneaking up behind the female secretaries that worked in his office and suddenly holding a pencil up to their neck and threatening to kill them. His office also happened to be directly above where Debbie's body was ultimately found inside of that stairwell. When interviewed by police, Ashlyn said he had been in Randall Hall the night Debbie had been killed, but didn't know Debbie, had no interaction with her, and didn't leave his office the whole night. He quickly agreed to take a lie detector test, but he failed it. Scrambling to explain it, he named 2 other students that were in the office with him that could be his alibi. But when police spoke to these 2 other students, they said, no, Ashlyn was not in the office the whole time. He left around 1 in the morning and was gone for about 3 hours. He said he was going to take a nap. When the police approached Ashlyn with this information, he said, oh, you know what? I forgot to tell you about my nap. Yes, I left for a few hours. I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, went back inside and slept in one of the study hall rooms. But besides that, I was inside of that building for a full 24 hours and I never saw Debbie. I had no interaction with her. It's just coincidence that my nap coincided with when she was killed. But detectives were not buying it. They believed wholeheartedly that now, finally, they had found their killer. But just like with Kurt and with Ziegler, they had no physical evidence tying Ashlyn to the crime, and so they couldn't arrest him. And because they were not able to make any arrests, the police just continued to look for more suspects. And so they began speaking to some of Debbie's friends and acquaintances, and it came out that Debbie actually had a stalker. It was another student named Alan Smith, who had previously been one of Debbie's very close friends, but at some point he wanted to take the relationship from platonic to romantic, and Debbie rejected him. Alan apparently didn't take this very well and took to following Debbie around campus, trying to get her to stop and talk to him and try to reconcile their relationship, but Debbie every time would just say no, and Alan got increasingly more angry about it, and just the day before Debbie was killed, their friends saw Debbie fighting with Alan in the middle of campus where Alan had actually grabbed her shoulder and was shaking her and yelling at her. Police tracked down Alan, and he was cooperative and said he did not kill Debbie, but he didn't have an alibi. He just said he was alone in his apartment on the night that Debbie was killed. And so like all the other primary suspects in this case, there was no physical evidence tying Alan to the crime, and so so they couldn't make an arrest. Around this time, the lab that tested the blood spatter that was on Debbie's chair inside of the computer lab came back with their results. DNA profiling was not available back then, so all they could provide was blood type. The blood type that came back from that little spot was type A, and Debbie's blood was type O, meaning this blood spot likely belonged to Debbie's killer, who during their struggle must have gotten wounded and then bled on the chair. And so right away, the police got Kurt Rayner, Bronson Ziegler, Ashlyn Bearhard, and Alan Smith to all come in and provide a blood sample, and they figured if any one of them was type A, that they probably were the killer. But unbelievably, when their test results came back in, none of them were type A. It was a crushing blow to the investigation. The first few days after Debbie's killing seemed so full of promising leads, but now with this blood type development, investigators had no suspects, and all of a sudden the Drexel community was starting to panic. Students were outraged at the light security and wondered why the security guards were not allowed to carry weapons. The administration put up a $10,000 reward for any information about who could have done this, and the president of the university told students to use the buddy system and never be alone on campus because he believed the killer was one of us. No one could understand why anyone would want to target Debbie in the first place. She seemed like such a wonderful person that was nice to everyone. She had modeled in high school, but she wasn't vain. She'd actually turned down getting braces because she was worried it might affect her clarinet playing. She was an average student, but she had an uncommon drive. She worked really hard to get good grades. Whenever she was feeling down or wasn't feeling motivated, she would stare at a picture of a Mercedes-Benz car that was there to inspire her and remind her what she could achieve if she continued to work hard. When she was killed, that picture of the Mercedes-Benz still hung above her desk. It was ultimately her work ethic that put her in danger because she was prepared to stay at that computer lab as long as it took to make sure her project was perfect. The few pieces of physical evidence the police had didn't fit together. The crime wasn't really a robbery. While she was missing her shoes and socks, her backpack had turned up at the campus lost and found about a week later, and no one knows how it got there or who put it there. Inside, it appeared all of her belongings were still there. Also, when she was discovered, she was still wearing her expensive watch. Her murder looked personal, but the police could not prove that someone who actually knew her was the one who killed her. Police considered a few other suspects, but like all the others, there wasn't enough evidence to make any arrests, and so eventually Debbie's case went cold. In 1985, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a story about unsolved cases that most haunted detectives, and Debbie's was one of them. Some of the detectives that were involved in the case said they believed this was a random killing and that the killer would most likely strike again. Debbie's case eventually disappeared from headlines, and it languished for 8 years. And then, in the spring of 1992, Debbie's murder was assigned to a cold case squad led by Detective Bob Snyder, and desperate to crack the case, Snyder threw a Hail Mary. He took the case to the VDOC Society, which is a private and highly selective club of geniuses from all walks of criminology. Homicide detectives, prosecutors, defense attorneys, FBI agents, forensic scientists, even an aeronautic physicist. They came from all over the world for these monthly closed-door sessions where they would talk about these unsolvable cases and try to solve them. So in one of their monthly closed-door sessions, Detective Snyder stood in front of the VDOC Society and laid out the details of Debbie Wilson's murder. Then he opened the floor to questions, and for hours the society got nowhere. Then Richard Walter, who was a founding member of the society, said that he had a theory. Walter was a famous criminal psychologist who had profiled some of the world's most infamous killers. Most of his work is actually still confidential. He believed the killer was a power-assertive, macho-type guy that liked being in control. Walter pointed to one clue that detectives and everyone seemed to have overlooked after all these years, and that was Debbie's missing shoes. He said the missing shoes were not random, they were the most important clue. The killer, Walter predicted, was a foot fetishist. Detective Snyder had nothing else to go on, and he was really intrigued by this idea, so he brought the information back to the cold case squad and they began re-interviewing everybody involved in the case. When they spoke with the manager of the computer lab at Randall Hall, he told them he was always bothered by one particular detail. The printers in the lab always turned off after 10 p.m., and so he was always confused how the security guard David Dixon could have heard the sound of printers inside the lab at 2:15 in the morning like he claimed. Detectives were shocked. Somehow no one had picked up on this discrepancy. They began looking more closely at David Dixon, who had been ruled out as a suspect and was viewed by and large as this pristine military veteran with no criminal history. and they dug all the way to the back of his military file where they discovered in 1979, the first year he was in the service, he had gotten in trouble for stealing another soldier's white Reebok sneakers, the exact type of shoe that Debbie was known to wear. Police began interviewing Dixon's former and current neighbors, and at least 4 women reported having a break-in when Dixon was living next to them, and the only thing missing was their white sneakers and dirty socks, although none of these women actually ever found out who was responsible. When they raided Dixon's apartment, they found in one of his closets 20 sets of used women's white shoes that were all wrapped in plastic like they were trophies. They also found 77 homemade videos, presumably shot by Dixon, that are just filming the feet of women walking around in white shoes. Dixon's alibi on the night that Debbie was killed was that most of the time he was on the phone with his girlfriend. His girlfriend had become his wife, and then she became his ex-wife. And so when detectives spoke to her, she told them that they had only spoke for a couple of minutes that night, not for a couple of hours. Police arrested Dixon in June of 1993, and he never admitted to anything, but as soon as he got into his cell, he started bragging to his cellmate about how he had killed Debbie because he wanted to have his way with her feet, and his cellmate immediately told on him. Dixon was ultimately found guilty of killing Debbie Wilson, and he was sentenced to life